Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Today we are coming together to hold an event on reforming the ETS, what to make of the revenues. We have 4 excellent speakers with very different perspectives on the topic. The schedule looks as following. We will have first a round of initial statements, relatively short ones, in order to have some time for questions and discussion at the end. For the discussion and the questions, we provide the possibility for participants and the audience to put those questions on Slido. So for that, please go to slido and enter the events code ETS. And then you could put in questions, you can vote them up, questions that you find interesting. And I will, in the second part of the event, try to select some of the most pertinent questions and put them to the speakers. Now, on the topic of today, we are in a situation where we will probably see a revision of the emission trading system next year, and that will potentially entail an increasing of the scope of the emission trading system and an increasing of the price of emission allowances. And that will translate into potentially significantly higher revenues for governments in Europe. And there are many good and many pragmatic reasons for using these revenues. You can use the revenues to reduce distributional effects between households, so reduce the regressive effects. You can try to support regions in transition. One can invest in technologies that reduce future mitigation costs. One can support competitiveness of industry, like is currently being done with the free allowances that are handed out or with the indirect cost compensation schemes. There has been a lot of talk about double dividends through reducing more distortive taxes, or if one prefers, for fiscal consolidation. And there has been obviously a big item of discussion on distribution between member states in order to allow less well-to-do member states to also subscribe to significant climate policies. And in all that, one has to acknowledge that emission trading revenues are special, as they have not primarily fiscal, but an environmental purpose, and hence a very specific time profile. I'm hearing a lot of noise. Maybe Jakob, you can mute. So we'll have 1 hour to try to settle that debate, which is certainly not going to happen. So my aim for today is to span a bit the discussion space of these very important discussions that we will see forcefully coming up in the beginning of next year. And with that, I would like to hand over the floor to Beatrice Jordi, who is a director at DG Klima and who is dealing with the emission trading system. Beatrice, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, George, and big hello to everybody. Very interesting times and also difficult times. So just let me start before talking about ETS of Global Green Deal. We have climate change at the heart of this mandate of the Commission. We have also, in parallel of the discussions of extending and strengthening the ETS, because it's a double discussion, also the current co-decision of European law, putting in legislation the upgraded 2030 objective and the climate neutrality. So also on the global picture, to emphasize the agreement it was found by the Council on the MFF, so the multi-annual financial plan, and also on the recovery plan. So climate change started in the Green Deal as a growth strategy. And we confirm that now it's not only growth, but it's also a recovery strategy. We're just putting the framework on the big money, the big budget, and the big policy. Now coming to ETS. We are in the process of starting, and it will be in the next days in public consultation. So, warm invitation to all of you to contribute to that on the ETS reform. We have in the last years solid prices at the level of 25 euro per ton, and that is creating changes in the power sector. We see it with the coal phasing out and the coal reduction on production. And so this reform will have two objectives. One is the reinforcement to be in line with the minus 55%, and the other is the extension to maritime. As you know, maritime, we have in place just a monitoring system, and we would like that maritime contributes to this decarbonization as the other sectors. And also it will be part of the discussion if the ETS is extended to building and transport with pros, cons, debates. So we are working in the Commission in the impact assessment. Public consultation will be coming. Warm invitation, as I said. And last point on the revenues. One of the big parts of the Green Deal is that without a fair transition, it will not be decarbonization path. So it's a must in the big part of the Green Deal. And as you know, we have a tab in the ETS that we can modulate what to do with the revenues. Shall it be more solidarity aspects? Can we be more fairness? Are we, with this fairness and solidarity, stopping a decarbonization? How we handle that? So your ideas are highly welcome in this debate, and looking forward to our discussion with you.
Thanks a lot, Björn. I would like now to give the floor to Sébastien. Sébastien works as project manager at I4CE, a think tank in Paris that has been dealing with climate issues globally and on a European level for many years. Sébastien.
Thanks, Leon. I'll try and share a few slides if it's okay. Have to do that. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let's see. Okay, so I'll try to give a general framework on this issue of carbon revenues and what is done worldwide and what the possible uses, based on some research we did for the World Bank 1 or 2 years ago. So so this is a very short introduction. This is Bill Nye, for those of you who recognize him, explaining what taxes in a very short time. In fact, we all know that this is a bit more complex than that. I've listed some of the low prices or high-profile economists that have invested time and resources in trying to understand the dynamics behind carbon taxes and revenue distribution. But what we learned mostly is that this is mainly not about economics. What we are discussing here is about governance management, communication, social inclusiveness, political resilience, environmental performance. I'm not bringing very new concepts here, but this is a key point when talking about revenue. We have to take into account that we are not talking only about the money. Some examples that I think are relevant to keep in mind when dealing about revenues from carbon taxes. The most recent and also most impactant communication-wise was the Yellow Vest movement in France, which started based on the carbon taxes and how the revenue was distributed. But the case in Indonesia, it took them like 20 years to reform their fossil fuel subsidies, because they had issues in, that was not the only point, but it was one of the main issues, how the revenue was spent. Revenue was part of the huge debate which led in Australia to a carbon tax repeal. And in British Columbia, it was at the center of a political heated debate that nearly killed the tax just after it was passed. In Canada, they managed to in British Columbia, they managed to maintain the tax, and they learned from this history when moving on at the national level with the carbon tax, with a very strong communication centered on revenue use and how they would redistribute revenue to the population. So these are examples of systems that are quite different from the EU ETS, but they all have in common that revenue use each time was a major focus, and what appeared in all these cases is that the focus was not only on textbook economics, but more like how to handle political economics and how to handle communication to partakers of the issues. So there has been a report. If you want more on these examples and more of them, the report is online on the World Bank site. Sorry. What we can derive for the main framework is that we have mainly 6 destinations for revenue use that Georg stated them at the beginning. You can finance the tax reform, you can finance debt reduction, you can directly spend the money to impacted households or businesses, or through tax cuts or free allocation, which is in both cases a way to protect and to target your support to impacted an impacted specific part of the population. Or you can spend it to finance some overarching goals, which can be climate change mitigation, but it can also go any other way, like development funding, like general budget or specific issues funding. Some of them cases we reviewed spent the money on higher education. So it could be anything as long as it is a very strong national priority. We compiled the national experience, the national choices with revenue use in this chart, which is the 2020 figures for revenue use. So you can see here that the EU ETS, as Beatrice was saying, the prices were high. So right now the revenue from the EU ETS make up the biggest chunk of carbon revenues worldwide. And actually European countries, either through the EU ETS or through national taxes, make up more than 3/4 of this revenues raised in the world. Since it is interesting to see that we have kind of different choices for revenue use. In green, it's mostly green earmarking. In yellow, it's general budget allocation. And then we have some, in purple, for example, it's direct transfers, which is interesting because it may not be the biggest chunk of this graph, but still it represents systems which were highly successful with their carbon tax or carbon pricing scheme design. So for us, it still deserves consideration, and the case is the same for the orange part, which was what Georg talked at the beginning of realizing real double dividend cases. Okay, so we have some success with a lot of designs. Some of them used earmarking and really earmarked their revenue for green projects. Some of them, like Sweden, which is often quoted as a very nice example, used to general tax reform. We have debt funding in Ireland or direct rebates in Switzerland. So all of them, the levels of taxes vary a lot, the use of revenue vary a lot. What we found is that these systems are widely accepted, and it was not in the end a choice about how the revenue was spent. The criteria were more about how it fits this specific country and specific moment in time national narrative. So we had some talk from Beatrice about how the fight against climate change fits now within the Green New Deal narrative and within the recovery narrative. So which is a good thing, and revenue the use of revenue has to integrate such a bigger picture at some point. You cannot just spend them on some very specific targeted use if it doesn't integrate a big picture. And also, it has to consider the whole reduction of financial flow thing. When you raise a tax and use the revenue, you're creating like losers and winners. Again, this is not rocket science, but it appeared that the most important roadblocks that we found in our studies were of a matter of not having built the necessary consensus from the taxpayers up front. So you can have all the, how to put this, you can have the best theoretical approach economically wise on how to equate marginal costs between the people that are to lose from the scheme and those that are to gain from it. If at some point someone considers that he's paying too much price for something that is not their priority, or something that they don't see the compensation or the interest, it's going to be a blockage in the process, and you have to have the consensus on the whole process of taxing and distributing the revenue. So there are many ways to do it, and I'll stop with that. Some of them use very high transparency schemes. On the top left, I like the picture. California used to, at some point, crash cars on the on public places to show very blatantly how the money was spent on new cars, and the guy who brought this old car for trash was given a new car totally financed by the carbon revenues. Or you can, if you can't or don't want to achieve this kind of high visibility communication schemes, another way is to guarantee that you're able, if you're using the revenue to fuel a state or an institution's budget, you're able to deliver a full assessment climate-wise on how the revenue you're raising is spent. And usually you have to go beyond only carbon revenues, and because carbon revenue are not always earmarked, no? So you have to take into account the variety of uses that really contribute to climate goals without being funded by carbon revenues, and the contrary, uses that are funded by carbon revenues but are deemed more important than the climate fight at some point, or and so it's not a problem as long as you can keep it transparent and are able to communicate on that. Okay, I think I'm done with these framing remarks and handing it over to you again, Georg.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Even though the Wi-Fi connection was not perfect, I think we got the points very clearly.
Sorry about that.
Not your fault. What I find most interesting for our discussion from that is that you essentially say there's different dimensions, and they might be interrelated, but they are not necessarily hard linked. So so how I understood it is that you say there's one kind of political distributional element, and there's one question on the spending items. But if you have spending items like tax reforms or funding decarbonization or any of the other spending items you mentioned, one might design them in different distributional ways so that you still kind of manage to work on both dimensions at the same time, which is, I guess, very important in a complex setting like the European Union, where it might be helpful to be able to still spend the money on the right things, while at the same time ensuring that the distributional effects of that make sure that you get the consensus that you need to pass the legislation. With that, I would like to pass the floor to Jean Pisani-Ferry, former director of Bruegel and now senior fellow, and he wrote a very controversial article a few months ago on what to do with ETS revenues. Jean, you have some slides.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Georg. So let me follow up, focusing on the particular issue of how to distribute ETS revenues between the EU and the member states, which is, complementary to what was just presented by Sébastien. This is based on a report I did with Clemens Fußt at the request of the German presidency of the EU, and we presented the report to the ECOFIN, to the informal ECOFIN Council in September. Now, if we're speaking of the ETS, this is the total revenue in the EU 27, currently 14 billion, with a big rise corresponding to the change in the price, which is now about 25 euros per ton, after a period in which the price was very low. So that's the starting point. Now, this represents 0.1% of the GDP of the EU. So, it's a sum, but from a macro standpoint, it's not that much. And it's going to evolve as a consequence of, first, the evolution of emissions, which are, expected to go down and to eventually vanish by 2050. To evolve as a consequence of the changes in the price. And here we may have different scenarios. And the question is, what's the price scenario that corresponds to the quantity objective of the EU, as it is being revised also, with the goal of tightening the objective for 2030 already. Here we have currently a reference scenario, which is probably not ambitious enough comparing to the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, which brings the price to 85 euros per ton in 2050. And the decarbonization scenario, I'm also based here on what's been produced by DG Klima, which brings the price to 200 euros per ton in 2050. So we would have a sort of a quantity going down, price going up. So eventually it should be zero. It's currently 14 billion, and so can be expected to increase in the meantime. And then we have two other variables: the share of allowances that are auctioned as opposed to given out for free. At present, it's about 60%. It could be more. And then the scope of the ETS, which is the sectors that are covered, about 45% of total emissions in the EU. And again, that could increase if the ETS is to be made a more significant instrument for the decarbonization strategy. So if you combine all that and you sort of try to find out what are possible scenarios for the total revenues, the outcome is that in a scenario, an extremely conservative and unrealistic scenario in which the price would remain constant and only the quantity would go down, then over 30 years, it would bring about 300 billion euros. If you take a scenario that's, in my view, more realistic, so in which you don't increase the share of auctioned allowances, you don't enlarge the scope of the ETS, but you take a price scenario that corresponds to the objective set by the EU, you're getting close to 800 billion, again, cumulative over 30 years. And if you're, to that, you're adding an increase in the share of auctioned allowances and an increase of the scope of the ETS, you could get to 1,500 billion euros. So significant, scope, but I think it's reasonable to reason on the basis of the scenario 3 that brings the total revenue to about 800 billion. Now, next question is, to whom should this money go in principle? What to make of the revenue? At present, the revenue goes to the member states. Now, it's a paradoxical situation because we're speaking of an EU policy. We're speaking of common objective, the EU is the negotiator in the COP agreement. The objective is set by the EU as a whole. And we have an EU instrument, which is the ETS. And in spite of all that, we're saying the revenues go to the member state. It's a bit like saying, we have a trade policy, we have customs revenue, and the customs revenue go to the country where the port of entry is located, which is the opposite of what we're doing, because the port of entry gets, a share corresponding to the administrative cost in principle of handling the customs duty, but the bulk of it goes to the EU, and it's a common resource. So what we're saying in the report is that the logic would be to consider that it should become an EU revenue source, so own resource in the EU jargon. Also because if the EU decides to change the parameter, to raise the bar, for example, why should it create additional revenue for the member states? Now, we're not saying this should be used to increase the spending at EU level. We're saying this should be used to changing the structure of EU revenue, and so to swap the current GNI-based revenue, which are the basis of the financing of the EU budget, for this ETS revenue in a budget-neutral way. So no increase in the EU budget, a change in the structure. That would create a temporary resource, because after 2050, in principle, this would be gone. I mean, it's what the economists call a Pigouvian tax, which is supposed to be achieving a certain policy aim. The aim is not to raise revenue. So by 2050, it would be gone. Now, what to do with a revenue source that would be gone by 2050? Perhaps precisely to pay back a certain debt. And we are at present with the Recovery and Resilience Initiative, we're speaking of a 390 billion debt of the EU that will have to be repaid by 2050. So we're speaking of something that's about half, about exactly half what the revenue that would be generated in scenario 3. And so it would be possible to have it paid back and at the same time to keep some revenue. Now, obviously, the difficulty is that this would have distributional consequences. Even if the revenues are swapped, I mean, for the GNI, this will have distributional consequences among member states. So how to deal with that? What we are proposing is to say, let's consider that there is a degree of grandfathering, that member states have a right to get some of the revenue accruing from the ETS on the basis of their share of the, let's say, 2019 total emission, to which would be applied a factor that would reflect the decrease over time of the total emission, so something that would be the quantity component declining, and to which would be applied a price that would be capped at 25 euros per ton, so the current price. So it would mean if the price is below that level, that would be, the revenue generated multiplied by the quantity. And if the price is above that level, whatever is above the 25 euros per ton level would go to the EU. So that would roughly give what you have here under the realistic scenario on the left and on the high revenue scenario on the right. The blue part would go to the member states. What's the color? Indigo part would go to the repayment of the recovery fund, and the green part would be left as a sort of net revenue for the EU. What we are proposing is that in order to offset some of the distributional effects that would affect adversely high carbon emitting member states, The green part would be used also to finance some offsetting transfers. And the green part, the size of the green part would depend on the evolution of prices. So it's basically our proposal in the realistic scenario. So the scenario corresponding to the picture on the left, 330 billion would constitute the grandfathering right, so the blue part. 390, the indigo part that goes to the repayment of the recovery fund, with a zero interest rate, and 70 billion to financing additional transfers or a further GNI swap. Without these transfers, there would be winners and losers. But if you put yourself in a situation in which everything would go to the member states, in fact, we would be creating major rents that would go to the member state for a reason that's not justifiable in terms of what creates this rent. And again, what creates this rent is basically an EU policy. So that's the reason why we're proposing this way out, by combining the grandfathering and the allocation, the assignment of this revenue to the repayment of the recovery fund. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jean. I think it's time to give the floor to Jakub Zawórski, who is a macroeconomics team leader at the Polish Economic Institute. So it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion. So in my initial speech, I would like to talk about this proposal that Jean was talking about. So I would like to present the argument against the incorporation of ETS revenue into the EU budget. I will talk about two main arguments against this idea. The first argument is that such a solution will be highly regressive. So it would shift the burden of financing the EU budget from the richest member states to the poorer ones. That is what Jean was talking about, the distributional effects. For example, when we think about France, the share of France in the EU's gross national income is around 17%, while the share of France in the ETS-based own resource will be much lower, around 7%. To the contrary, we have countries like Poland and other CEE countries, but also, for example, Greece, which will pay more than their income indicates. For example, the share of Poland will be around 10%, while the share of Poland in gross national income of the European Union is 4%. The share of Greece will be 4%, while in GNI, it is only around 1%. So to sum up this argument, the proposal to incorporate ETS revenue into the EU budget is a reversal of what the EU budget was supposed to be. Because so far the EU budget was an instrument to push the convergence between poorer and richer EU member states, and it was working in the last dozen of years. It was the basis of the EU integration, and that's something we should definitely not change, in my opinion. The awareness of countries like Poland and other CEE countries about the need to act quickly and strongly to fight the climate change is now growing rapidly. So we should not take the money from the countries that have the highest needs in terms of energy and climate transition, because it may stop the desirable process. And the second argument why it is not a good idea to incorporate the ETS revenue into the EU budget, I think such a solution will distract the attention from something that is extremely important, but also extremely challenging. I mean, fair taxation of multinational corporations within the EU. The EU Commission has proposed a solution, the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, CCCTB. That's a good solution, but extremely hard to introduce, because there will always be some countries that will oppose to such solutions, because they just benefit from the current system. I mean, Ireland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Malta, Cyprus, and also Belgium. These are the intra-EU tax havens that they benefit from the current system, but of course to the detriment of the other EU member states, because they help multinational corporations to shift the profits to the traditional tax havens. And that's the problem we should definitely solve within the EU. And what I am afraid of is that making ETS funds an EU budget own resource will make it less probable that we will solve the problem of taxation at the EU level. Because when we will have new own resource, the pressure to find them in another place will be just lower. Some countries may say, look, we have some new revenues. Is there really a need to tackle now this politically very sensitive problem? And what is very important in this context is that incorporating ETS revenues into the EU budget is just moving the funds that already exist from one place to another. While fair taxation of multinational corporations is a solution that is at the same time much more fair and creates new funds, new revenues for the EU. So I think, to sum up, it would be better to talk now about how to tax the corporations that move the profits between different jurisdictions, and to put a large pressure on solving this problem, rather than to talk about how to move away the revenues from the countries that need them the most, and to have a successful energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. For me, what I find fascinating in this discussion is compared to a few years ago when carbon pricing was discussed as a climate policy instrument, that now there is, obviously because of the significant upcoming revenues, it's becoming a completely different debate, and with completely different stakeholders. And I guess I still have to see whether that's a good thing for climate policy or a bad thing for climate policy. Now, maybe as Jakob, you directly addressed Jean's paper. Jean, would you like to quickly react to that?
Yes, very quickly. So to say that I agree on the second point on taxing multinationals, and I agree that there would be a big difference, that would create a new revenue source, that would correct the distortion, so that would create sort of broaden the tax base at EU level. So completely in agreement on that, and that would be something permanent as opposed to the ETS, which is temporary, as I said. But I don't see a substitution between the two. I mean, we're speaking of, in general, the structure of own resources. And at present, the EU budget is almost entirely financed by the GNI-based contribution. So having the taxation of multinationals would change, somewhat the structure, and having the ETS would also be a temporary addition that would be perfectly compatible. Where I do not agree is on the distributional argument. Obviously, I agree that France would be a clear winner. So France would have to pay more in another way. I mean, clearly, in this negotiation and offsetting transfer, you couldn't say that because France has a nuclear sector that produces so much of the electricity, France could just win in this game. There would need to be an offsetting contribution. But when you say that nothing should be changed, now if we don't change anything, I take the example of Bulgaria. If you project what would be the ETS revenue of Bulgaria under the realistic scenario, it would amount in 2030 to 0.5% of GNI. And under a scenario in which the price would increase faster, and as I said, this is very much possible, you could very much approach a situation where it would pay for the entire contribution of Bulgaria to the EU budget. That's what I call a rent. That would be no justification for something like that. So what I'm saying is that yes, part of the revenue should be kept by the member states, but there needs to be a re-examination of the distribution of revenues between the EU and the member states in light of this likely evolution corresponding to our new climate objectives.
Okay. To avoid that it gets a dialogue, I would like to give the floor to Bea.
Very, very interesting discussion, and I feel a little bit like in a mini council, because all the points that you are putting on the table, I'm sure there will be a discussion in the mini council or mini parliament. Just to very interesting ideas from Jean, from Jacob, and from Sebastian. Just of course, we need to consider what is the whole budget, the whole EU budget devoted to, and the enormous component on solidarity that is there. I mean, that I think this is not only the revenues, it's the whole picture, and also the recovery, that we have a historical movement that's with this big crisis, we are backing member states in the recovery plans. Just the own resources debate is there. And this is not a surprise for you. When I started to be director nearly 4 years ago, we had to justify the beauties of ETS. Now it's a very attractive system and a very attractive quantity of money. So we are together with plastics, we are with multinational on the table to discuss if part of it should go there. Also, there's another distributional aspects that is different of each sector. For example, the ETS in aviation has a distributional effect different than an ETS on buildings. And this, in our small ETS world, needs to be reminded. And we can have also distributional positive things if we think about low-income houses, not low-income countries, because unfortunately the low-income houses is all over Europe. So we need to be un peu fin. I mean, there are the macro numbers, but then it's the design of the system and the adaptation to the different realities. And just to say one last point before we go on this very interesting debate. It was a big discussion in the Council in the last revision on the 50% obligation of revenues from member states to reinvest in climate, to invest in climate. Currently, we are at 70%. And the transparency we have been pushing, it was a debate in both Parliament and Council. And I think it's something that we will need to, needs to come back to the table. I will not propose a photograph with a car smashed. I think that at transparency, I will not be brave enough. And I think that we have electric car solutions also, but to have a good transparency of what this money goes to and how this reinvestment is generating richness or is reinverted in the society. So it's for me a very important point, is transparency and minimum threshold for member state expenditure.
Can I maybe try to amalgamate your question on transparency together with some question we got on Slido on the modernization fund and give it to Sebastian? So my question would essentially be, is there maybe an intermediate solution between what Jacob and Jean has been saying about kind of where the money should go, in the way that the European Union is currently dealing with that by creating special funds that, like the modernization fund or just transition fund, that take money from ETS revenue and then distribute them to specific purposes, so in a transparent way, but then also with a certain regional distribution. So is that a solution or is that more of a problem?
Okay, I'm sorry, this won't be a yes or no answer. From what we found empirically in our research on carbon revenue use, most countries, or a high number of countries, are really, or institutions are really allergic to these special funds because they bring in a sort of split effort, and we lower the overall consistency of the budget. There needs to be at some point some parliament control on the whole budget, and if you start isolating this or that fund, there has to be a very specific reason for that. So this being said, in the field of environmental revenue raising and revenue use, it has been used a lot, but it's more for like historical reasons, which is actually the case of the EU ETS. You start with a very small tax or very small system, which raises a very small amount of money. So this is handled by specialists of the environment and not by budget specialists. And at some point, the revenue raises, and so grows the discussion on how it should be used, and someone steps in and says, okay, this should now reintegrate the common budget. And this is what happened in France recently with we had a special fund for the energy transition, and since last year it doesn't exist anymore. This money went back into the general budget. So this is not to say I'm against, or we didn't find that special funds are not the solution in any cases, but it's more like if this kind of solution is used, the most important thing is not to lose the general picture. So the point about transparency, the point about having an accounting system that is able to really balance the choices and integrate these special funds is fundamental. If you have special funds, you still need to be able to balance the choices and make arbitrages, trade-offs between the whole thing, and not try and separate and earmark some issue and leave it aside, because at some point it will come back and backfire.
Okay. I've got one question to Jakob. Maybe can you comment a bit on the you're not having the Polish position, but you're the Pole in the into this event on funds, because Poland seems to currently benefit quite from the Just Transition Fund, for example.
Yes, for countries like, well, I will first answer some issues that others were talking about. First, 100% agree with your statements about transparency. We definitely need to improve transparency of how the funds are spent from different sources that go for fighting with climate change. That's 100% true. Also, about the Polish situation, but it's not only Polish, it's the situation of almost all Central and Eastern Europe countries, which were just the starting point was completely different, because we had at the beginning the very high share of coal in energy production. We have a proposition which goes that we have now an updated climate policy, new target, new more ambitious goals. So we think we cannot use the outdated reference period, which is now 2005 to 2007 in ETS. This is a historical benchmark that goes too far back in time, missing the current challenges. And I believe that it would be much more credible to update the allocation key to the average, for example, 2016 to 2016, from 2016 to 2018 ETS emission data, and such a benchmark would show us the real effort countries make to achieve the new goals we have set up now. According to the allocation of the funds and what to make of revenues and where these revenues should go, we think that yeah, indeed, the increasing the modernization fund and or creating another funds is a compromise solution in this discussion. The need for investment will be even larger as the EU goals are now becoming even more ambitious, and we also need to think about a solution which will relieve the poorest and most vulnerable citizens from negative impact of increased ETS prices. This will translate into higher energy prices, and this will be borne by the end users, in particular households, which can deepen energy poverty and undermine the social acceptance for ambitious climate policy in many member states, especially the CE countries. And we propose, for example, an energy solidarity fund, so a fund which objective would be to support the poorest member states in eliminating the negative social effects related to the increase in energy prices, and minimizing the increase of energy poverty growing in the future. The funds can be used to create programs for households to decrease their energy expenses, such as increasing the energy efficiency of buildings.
Okay, so it's already a polished proposal. I will have to look into that. Maybe one question to Jean from the Slido side. There was one question on the proposal for revenues to EU. Would this not increase political opposition at member states level to increase the ambition SUS impeding climate action? So when the money goes to member states, might they then not be less willing to increase ambition?
I think it brings us into the the political economy of what we're doing here. And I think Sébastien minutes ago said, when it starts small, you don't, or at least public opinion doesn't look into that, and it's something for specialists. When it grows big, it's becoming a political issue. And I think there is no way we can escape this debate. I mean, on the major distributional dimension of these choices, and keeping things as they are, it's very easy to attack the system as it is. You would say, why is it that actually revenues are based on the extent of the sin? Because you're basically historical emissions that the countries that contributed the most to the emissions. That basically something you want to tax because it's bad. Now it's creating a source of revenue that go to the country that maybe it was not their responsibility in the first place. I mean, it's the legacy of history, but it's still the case that it goes where the emission were the highest. And that would be very easy to attack politically by those who oppose the system by saying it's completely unfair and doesn't make sense. So I think we need to look into that and to not just reason in terms of what what was decided a few years ago when the system was very much in infancy and a solution pragmatically had to be found. If we're speaking of an instrument that's going to be one of the major instruments underpinning climate action, it needs to be looked at with fresh eyes.
One, I think, related question here is what sort of reform of the ETS we will be getting, and maybe that I'm sure that they cannot give us clear visibility on what the result is going to be. But my understanding is that everything is currently on the table, and what is also on the table is the effort sharing regulation and what happens to the sectors that are currently not in the ETS. And here, obviously, there are already in the past a backlog of distributional decisions that have been taken within the European Union, and that somehow, to get a compromise, there will be a need to grandfather some of the old distributional effects, I presume. And so is that maybe an opportunity to, sorry, my camera fell down. Is that potentially an opportunity to discuss with more flexibility when discussing about opening up the two elements at the same time, or is that essentially making it even more complicated to find a solution?
Well, if I may, I mean, first, I agree with the fresh eyes. I hope doesn't mean that you want to kick me out of the ETS responsibility, but I completely agree that we need fresh eyes and also the change of scale. We have is not only that the prices have jumped from 5 to 25 due to the last reform, but it's also the absolutely big new context. So the context is a crisis, but the context is a clear identification of decarbonization with new opportunities and millions of jobs created. I mean, we forget that talk about 4 million jobs in green technologies, and just wind energy 350,000. And I always say that we have a cycling European industry blooming. But this is an important point, what we do with the effort sharing, and because it has a big, important distributional, key distributional effects there. Of course, it complicates the picture. I will not hide it. It complicates the picture, but it gives more flexibility in the decision making. The Green Deal has put, as I was mentioning before, and it's obvious for all of you, is at the heart of this mandate. But we have a complex exercise that we are putting on the table, very different proposals of very different nature in parallel. And we have not talked about one source of possible resources, which is the CBAM, the border adjustment. That is also part of the equation of possible funding. It's I think it's complex, but I think it's a fair exercise that we are not only looking at one instrument, but we are putting all on the table. And of course, the ETS is very close related to the renewable file, how the renewable will evolve, because we know that the carbon phase out has been due, of course, to coal prices, gas prices, but clearly ETS and the renewable policies. So it's the whole picture that we are putting. So yes, complex. I think it increases the flexibility, but it's clear that the ambition of the exercise is a complicated one, but it's center of the European priority. And if I could say, Parliament is back us on that, and majority of member states, all member states, I mean, I would say all member states are committed to the 55%. So it's a new change of scale. It's the fresh eyes, and it needs to be fresh and big.
Jean, you want to react?
No, I mean, I think we're very much in agreement. And, you know, I mean, the value of a proposal that like the one we made, just to sort of, you know, put some rough numbers on the table and to open a debate with, you know, the freedom of being expert academics who can look at things without having to enter all the complexity and all the political compromises. But the point we're making is that this discussion needs to take place, and that it needs to be linked. Also, that's what you said, Beatrice, about the change of scale. It needs to be linked to the broader issues also that have come up with the Next Generation EU initiative and all this debate on own resources. Because if I assess a word on own resources, we're speaking, you know, if you look at the potential candidate for own resources, and I would put aside the taxation of multinationals because it depends on an agreement within the OECD, so it depends on the attitude of the next US administration that's much more, you know, complicated internationally. For the rest, we're speaking of trivial amounts, completely trivial amounts. So if we want to speak of something that commensurate to the issues, you know, that arise with this Next Generation EU initiative, the ETS is inevitably part of the answer. And carbon border taxation is not a good candidate. No, it's not a good candidate because there is this illusion that you're going to let the Chinese pay for us, which is a complete illusion. Because if the price is I mean, if it's to be to serve something, it's then the price needs to be higher, which means the European consumer will pay for it. So I regard this carbon border adjustment as a way to ensure that you can actually broaden the scope of the ETS, not as a way to sort of by magic tax, you know, whoever else and pretend that the European consumer is not going to pay for our policy. We don't hear you.
Sorry. I would, yes, sorry. I would have one last question to whoever feels like answering it. coming from the chat, and I found it very thought-provoking but complicated. Which is we have very volatile prices in the ETS, and now how do we design a system in which this volatility of carbon prices does not kind of create issues with, at some point, some member states are significantly better off, and another point of time, other member states are significantly better off. So do we need a sort of more carbon price color to make sure that that these distributional effects that happen over time are buffered, or is there maybe some automatic stabilization that is actually useful in that? Any views on that question? Otherwise, we would have to leave it open.
If I may start with my comments, and it's well, carbon prices are an old debate. It will be a part of this debate again, I'm sure. Just that prices have been very volatile. Well, not in the last 2 years, I have to say. We don't have. We have survived also the crash. I mean, the COVID crash. So we have points of 19 euros, and we have been 27, 25, 26. So we have an average of 25 in the last 2 years. So I think that the MSR did its work. Last reinforcement also, and they are working. So I think that the volatile pre 2 years before, so the past, you're right. In the last 2 years, I don't think so. But carbon price is there. So if it's a minimum of auctioning, a cancellation, if it's a guarantee, then of course the political importance. But I think that, as you know, in the Commission, we are more in the line that MSR needs to do its job. And we have gone to this option, but I don't think that the carbon price, the floor price, is going to be out of the debate. I would be surprised.
Okay, I think with the obviously we didn't come to a conclusion today. I think the time of the event is up, and we have all hopefully more interesting questions than we had before that we want to look into and research into. Bruegel will continue to work on the topic, and I presume many of you in the audience and participants as well. So it remains to me to thank you all for participation, for taking the time, and hoping to see you soon again. Thank you very much.